Hello, my name is Derek Lynch, and today I'll be arguing through this presentation that the death penalty should be abolished in the United States. So the number currently is 1,517. That's how many people since the 1970s have been executed in the United States, according to the Death Penalty Information Center. Now, the methods that we use in the United States have varied over the years, but they've included lethal injections, cyanide gas, and even hanging. Now, today I'm not going to argue about the emotional or moral argument against the death penalty. Rather, I'm going to argue that the death penalty is ineffective. I'm going to argue that it's inequitable, that it's imprecise, and that it's unconstitutional. And as I go through this presentation, I'm really going to focus on those three areas as to why I think that the death penalty should be abolished. So first, I want to talk about equitability, and more specifically, why the death penalty is inequitable. First, based on race. So according to the American Civil Liberties Union, 43% of executions since 1976 have been people of color. And currently, 55% of the inmates that are on death row are people of color. People of color are disproportionately represented in those that are sentenced to death and executed, and that shows an issue with equity. Likewise, the ACLU has argued that, or has asserted that as of 2002, there have been 12 cases of execution in which a white defendant murdered a black victim. The opposite, there have been 178 cases where a black defendant has murdered a white victim and been sentenced to death. 12 cases for white defendants, 178 cases for black defendants of people who have been put to death. That's inequitable and shows that the death penalty should be abolished. Another reason why the death penalty should be abolished is that, in line with inequitability, is that poor people are not able to access the legal counsel that they need in order to represent themselves in these trials. Ruth Bader Ginsburg said in 2011, "I have yet to see a death case among the dozens coming to the Supreme Court in which the defendant was well represented at trial." People who are well represented at trial do not get the death penalty. It's been well established by the Death Penalty Information Center that folks who don't have the economic resources are given public defenders who have too many cases, are not able to adequately distribute their time to all of the cases that they're supposed to represent, and as a result, their clients don't receive adequate legal counsel and are more likely to be sentenced to death than someone who can afford a private attorney. So not only is the death penalty an equity issue, it's also not a precise means of determining who should face punishment for different crimes. According to the Innocence Project, 367 people since 1992 have been wrongfully convicted, meaning that they were either sentenced to death and then exonerated, or sentenced to death and then executed, even though they were later exonerated of the crime that they committed. The National Coalition Against the Death Penalty has found that 1 in every 10 people that are sentenced to death is eventually set free, either before they're executed or exonerated after. The other thing that's really not precise about the death penalty is the length that individuals spend on death row. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, it's on average that an inmate spends 15 years on death row after being convicted, awaiting their sentence. And those predominantly men that are on death row are at higher risk for developing health conditions, mental health challenges. A lot of these inmates are spending 23 or 24 hours every day in solitary confinement. They're having their freedoms restricted, and as I had previously mentioned, many of them are being exonerated. So this time that they're spending in prison, being restricted from their freedoms, is ultimately robbing them of their health. So moving on from precision, my final argument against the death penalty is that it's unconstitutional. The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution guarantees due process under the law for all United States citizens. But we see that in these cases in which individuals are sentenced to the death penalty, they're not receiving this due process. As I've previously mentioned, inadequate legal counsel leads to a higher likelihood that one is sentenced to death, and that inadequate counsel is robbing an individual of their right to due process. Likewise, racial identities, people of color are more likely to be convicted and sentenced to death, and that means that because of the color of their skin, they're not receiving the due process of the law that white people are. Another constitutionality issue for the death penalty is the Eighth Amendment, and the Eighth Amendment bans cruel and unusual punishment in the United States. Now, I have already asserted why the death penalty is cruel and unusual punishment. Separate from the fact that the individual is executed, the methods that are used, whether it's historically been cyanide gas, it's been hanging, or it's been lethal injections, these methods are cruel. Likewise, the length that an individual spends on death row, 15 years on average before they're executed, that's a cruel punishment that frankly is unconstitutional. So in conclusion, as I've tried to persuade you that the death penalty should be abolished, I focused on 3 areas. First, I talked about inequity. I talked about why people of different races statistically are more likely to be sentenced to death, and the impact that legal counsel has on your sentencing. Next, I talked about precision, wrongful convictions, wrongful executions, and the amount of time that an individual spends on death row. And finally, I talked about the Fifth Amendment, the Due Process Clause, and the Eighth Amendment, the clause against cruel and unusual punishment, as reasons why the death penalty is unconstitutional. So as of today, 20 states have abolished the death penalty in the United States. This is something that matters, and it matters because people are getting put to death, oftentimes for crimes that they're not committing. So I hope after hearing this presentation, you'll agree with me that in the United States, the death penalty should be abolished. Thank you so much for your time.